And we are live. Good evening, LBE community, wherever you are. I don't know why, but it seems like it's been a while since we've been here, but I know that is not true. And as always, we have a phenomenal discussion that we're about to have live, and it was very interesting in preparing for this conversation just a few moments ago. I'm just excited about what will be covered in this discussion this evening. Sister, Madam Facilitator, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. I'm excited for this conversation for sure.
Me too. You know, can you just tell us, you know, I can't wait for you to, in your opening statement, to start us off with how did we get here for this particular conversation. And this is one that I definitely would encourage viewers to please tell your friends to join us, and if they cannot see this live, to make sure that they go back and see this, because you know, anytime we bring these discussions on ethnicity and inequality, the two together, it always makes for a good conversation. And I'm choosing to be conscious in the words that I use. I always try to be that way, but race is a negative word, and the very use of it implies that one group of people is against another, is running or somehow against the other. So these are conversations about cultural awareness, and these are necessary conversations with the goal of unity. And that is why we use community a lot when we're talking about the lived Black experience. And so I'm excited because this evening, when we're talking about community, one unity, it is interesting that we as people of African descent are not talking about just ourselves, but we're talking about other cultures coming together as one. So with that being said, Madam Sister Baby Queen Facilitator, I'm very excited, and please take it away.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited for this conversation as well. This is, first of all, it's not often that I get to be part of the conversation, but tonight's conversation is one that is bringing together a lot of different things. You know, we are talking about the significance of land acknowledgements and what they traditionally mean for particularly Indigenous and Native communities. We're having a conversation about where the original land acknowledgement that was shared upon council request with City Council for their considerations for adoption of a land acknowledgement, what that full text looked like and what the intentions were behind the crafting of that document. And then what happens when that document then is changed, and what happens to our understandings and our engagement with a broader community and a unified community when part of that narrative is erased. We want to talk about what it means to come together in terms of pursuing justice, equity, and inclusion. What does that look like as a broader community? And what does it mean for a project like the Live Black Experience to be seeking that for not just the Black community, but for all of Flagstaff and for all of our community members? So that is a broad strokes look at what we're going to be talking about tonight. And I am excited to welcome on our two guests for this evening. And I'm going to start us off by just asking that they introduce themselves. So I will start with you, Dr. Allen, if you'll give us just a brief introduction of yourself.
Yes, so great to be here with you all. My name is Dr. Traya Allen. I am at the University of Arizona and Pima Community College. Great to be in community with you one more time.
Thank you. And Ms. Kiara Weathersby.
Good evening. My name is Kiara Weathersby. I am Pingles Clan, or Tetna Zutney, enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation, and I am I'm currently at Northern Arizona University, where I serve as a manager of student development here in the Office of Indigenous Student Success, among other titles that I hold here at the university. Thank you for having me.
Thank you both for joining in this evening. Like I was saying, this is going to be a really interesting and engaging conversation. I look forward to hearing from both of you as we talk through this topic. So to get us started, I just want to talk about the history of land acknowledgements, where they come from, what they mean, and in particular, we'll talk a bit about the history of the land acknowledgement that was shared as part of the city's move to adopt an acknowledgement as an opening for their meetings. So before we get there, I just want to start with you, Dr. Allen. If you can talk about, you were a key part of drafting an initial land acknowledgement. If you can just share what your work was, what your process was there, and how you view the significance of land acknowledgements in general.
Absolutely. So I was going to be a keynote speaker or a conference speaker. I think it was a conference speaker. And I was coming back home to Northern Arizona University. And I had just started reading a lot about connections and the inner workings of the Black community here in America and Native American people. And one of the things that stood out to me was this practice of acknowledging the land. It was something that was foreign to me at the time. But the more I started to kind of learn about it, I felt like it was really important to establish that as a grounding piece. But not just acknowledging the land, but then also acknowledging the gift that we are walking around on, that we don't even consider how we benefit from the land. And so because I didn't know where to start, I just knew that it felt like almost like this is something that needed to happen. I actually went to our Native American Student Association at the University of Arizona. I spoke with the director, and the director and I then called up to Flagstaff together and asked, we have one of our, colleagues who is coming up to Northern Arizona to present, Flagstaff in particular. How should we acknowledge the land that you are on? And I just remember the individual, I had drafted something, and it was the nuances of the corrections, right? So that land acknowledgement started with, we acknowledge the immemorial connection. So these nations and communities have been connected to this land since time immemorial. And regardless of the current or historical colonization practices, these people, these nations would always be connected to this land, regardless of how we have, you know, entered treaties and all of these other practices, they would always be connected to the land. But the really important part was to move beyond just acknowledging that these individuals were once prominent in the land, but to also return back to, no, this is their land. It's always connected, right? And so you can't bring in arbitrary systems to any land and say, well, we gave you a piece of paper, so now it's ours, right? And it was about bringing to the forefront their enduring connection. And enduring is a really key word here. So when being educated on what a land acknowledgement was, it goes beyond just the now kind of what feels like a, you know, the PC thing to do. I'm going to start this off by giving a land acknowledgement. But really, when I dug deeper into this, we know that this practice has been happening for centuries. This is not a new practice. It's just new to non-Native people. And it has become more prominent as we become more PC, right? So we'll acknowledge the land, but we won't acknowledge much else at all. And so going beyond just a land acknowledgement, it also calls us to be responsible of how we benefit from supremacy, white supremacy in particular. And it also makes us think about, how do we pay restitution beyond just an acknowledgement, right? Because words can be hollow. And so that was the practice of it. And I will tell you that practice was more so me sitting and learning and listening to what this is about, more so than me saying, oh, I'm going to write this land acknowledgement and give it. It actually had to be blessed and given permission, right? Those words had to have permission, because every time I use that land acknowledgement, I am amplifying the words of communities that are still connected to that land.
Thank you. It's such a powerful overview. And I think it touches on something that so often gets missed as part of the conversation, is that it's more than just acknowledgement. It necessitates and demands action. And that's something that, like you said, so often gets put to the side when it comes to modern conversations about land acknowledgement. Is it enough to just read the statement and consider the work done, or is this actually a call to action that's calling us to do something more? So that's a really powerful thought as part of this conversation. Ms. Kiara, I want to come to you and just ask, for you, the significance of land acknowledgements and how you view the purpose or the intention of them.
Thank you. I think Dr. Allen, in sharing what she did, really put us in a place of, when we're talking about enduring or long-lasting, right? Indigenous, the folks that are here and whose land was forcibly taken, regardless of an agreement or a treaty that was signed, there were still genocidal acts that happened to these communities. And in acknowledging that the people their connections to the land, to the space is immemorial, is important, because we are still here. And we do still live here, regardless of the ways that governmental policies have tried to eradicate Indigenous peoples from their lands. And so no matter where we are within the Americas, we know that that land has been taken from people forcibly. And we've even identified now folks who this is their Indigenous land, are now considered immigrants because of those governmental policies and political boundaries that have been added. But also part of my lineage is that I am a descendant of enslavement, right? And so on my side of the family, I am Tetnizutni because I come from my mother, and all of the mothers before her in a matriarchal society have given me my lineage as a Tetnizutni woman. But then I also have my African American father, right? But because of those same governmental policies and of the human trafficking that brought my relatives here to these lands, right? I've also been assimilated into Western colonial society and don't know anything about my language or my community through my indigenous African American diaspora. And so I think that when we're having the conversation about indigenous folks and naming those things, including white supremacy that continue to pit us against one another, that's where we are trying to acknowledge all of the people, all of the beings, all of our relatives who are still here. And I think that that unintended erasure comes from when we start to, because of assimilation, believe in those governmental tactics that would have us push against one another or our relatives so that we can fit within society. And so that is my kind of, from what I've learned so far, is why we need to have land acknowledgements, because it's including the ways that the people who have been here and the other people, the people who have been brought here against their will and who have built the land as we know it, and including them in the acknowledgement of the labor and the ways that we continue to benefit from in any place that we are located in these United States.
Thank you so much. So for my part of this conversation, I want to give folks a better sense of how we got here. How did we get to this conversation tonight? And part of where this conversation is coming from is it's very much a twofold conversation. There is conversation of what it means to for this very group, the group that's hosting this conversation, the Live Black Experience, to be sharing these community dialogues and be having these conversations. And who is it for? The question of, is this just for Black people, or is it a broader conversation? And something that we've seen that's been, from my perspective, and I think the perspective of those who are part of this group, we've tried to make very clear that, as we say within the Live Black Experience strategic plan that was adopted by the city of Flagstaff, the story of Black America is the story of America. The story of Black Flagstaff is the story of Flagstaff. It's a conversation that is inclusive and broader than just any one community. And it's based in a concept of solidarity with other communities, and the idea that by asking for that acknowledgement as part of Flagstaff's history, we're asking for a broader cultural acknowledgement of what happens when we raise the voices of those who have been ignored or erased from the conversation. The other part of this conversation then comes from the recently adopted land acknowledgement through the city, that at the offset of that conversation, there was a request to the Southside Community Association and the Live Black Experience group to share the land acknowledgement that was shared as we were giving initial presentations of this plan. And I want to read that statement to everyone for those who maybe haven't heard this before or haven't had a chance to see it, because it's part of the important conversation that we're having tonight. So this statement reads, we recognize that this place we call home sits at the base of the sacred peaks on homelands shepherded by more than 12 tribal nations and indigenous peoples throughout this region. We honor them, their legacies, their traditions, and their past, current, and future generations who will forever call this place home. We recognize that this dream we carry of beloved community rests on the shoulders of Black women and men who populated the historic Southside community of Flagstaff, who worked the lumber yards and various industries through which Flagstaff historically thrived, and who continue to toil for recognition, memory, and unity. We recognize and acknowledge that the very foundation of the United States of America was built on the free and forced labor of Black people of the African diaspora and Black people indigenous of this land. This foundation has generational and exponential effects that continue to negatively impact Black communities today and remain uncompensated. The historical and contemporary contributions of the Black diaspora continue to shape American culture and benefit all inhabitants of this land. So that is the full statement that was shared. And one of the things that we found so interesting and a little alarming when it was shared that we had shared the statement was that in the eventual adoption of a land acknowledgement that happened, the entire second half of that statement was erased. And it's a part of the statement that was really focused in on the sense of solidarity of various communities and in elevating multiple voices as part of an ongoing conversation. And so that's really where we're coming from in this conversation tonight, is figuring out what does it mean when, whether intentionally or unintentionally, voices are erased from the conversation. What does it mean when, in pursuit of identity, we have to choose to be either one or the other form of identity? What does it mean when for one group to have, another group must go without? Or for one voice's group to be heard, another voice has to be silenced? And how do we confront that as part of a broader conversation? So to move along the conversation, I want us to dive into that and talk about identity, unity, and solidarity, and how those things are defined within ourselves and how we see them defined within community. So Ms. Kiara, I want to come back to you and just have you share a little bit. We were having a really interesting and I think powerful conversation at the offset of this in terms of your own identity, and you shared some of that coming into this segment of how you have struggled with areas where you can get a sense of your ancestry and your history and that identity, in places where that sort of knowledge or ability to get into that has been erased or taken away from you. And you had shared something too very powerful about the struggle of where you fit in the narrative of helping to shape these conversations if you're allowed to be a voice. So I'd love to hear more from you on just your thoughts about your identity and the broader conversation of what it means to have those multiple and intersecting identities.
Thank you. What I shared is the anxiety that comes from having both Indigenous and African lineage, and the ways in which double consciousness works for me is that I have both these identities, but in a patriarchal society, I'm also a matriarch. And so in thinking about how I am part of this land, how my father's people have always been part of this land, and that's how I came to be, is part of the struggle of, I guess, the idea of being enough. I think Dr. Allen had shared wonderfully before about blood quantum and how that has played into the white supremacy tactics of division, I think Dr. Erica Coleman had written a book that the blood, I think it's like That the Blood Be Pure. And it talks about how Indigenous folks were going to lose their land if they were procreating with any of those folks who were brought from the African diaspora. And those folks then othered their family members in order to not lose that land that they had gained through those agreements or those treaties. And so I think that trauma, secondary trauma, is still here with me because I was told, I went to Aotearoa, or New Zealand, and what they told us is that, you are the water of both your mother and your father. So no matter what, you carry all of those things. You carry the traumas, you carry the joy, you carry all of it. And I think that is something that I'm learning daily so that I can raise my child to be more informed about who they are and their intersecting identities. And really making sure that in identifying those things that we are naming the folks, that we are naming Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who gave us intersectionality, and really talking and giving credit to those voices of color and amplifying their voices instead of just acknowledging all of the work and labor that they've done in the continued I guess the colonization that happens, where we're just taking from people and continuing to take without giving credit where credit is due. And I think that's where that conversation of reparations comes in. But again, because I'm barely learning about this as an adult learning about treaty rights, learning about Indigenous and African relations and the governmental policies that were put into place so that my family would not have any land or any ownership of anything if they chose to continue to be together. And I think that trauma is something that creates that friction when I'm asked to speak up, because I don't feel necessarily enough. Because I've always had to provide a certificate of Indian blood to say, oh, I'm half Navajo. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Navajo Nation, but I'm only half, right? And but one drop makes me fully Black, right? And so it's like I'm full, but I'm half. And so just kind of that trauma of really of whose voice can I say? But I'm always amplifying other voices. And so I want to share tonight that in holding true to myself and holding true to all of the ancestors who came before me and were able to survive enough to get me to here, that I just wanted to kind of share my thoughts on where I've started to gain some knowledge. By no means an expert in trying to continue to amplify the voices that are typically taken from and then not credited for the work or not compensated for their work. And so I think that's a large part of me being in my role now, is to support students and amplify their voices and help them to grow in ways that I've been helped and shaped in my time. So I think that answered the question. I hope it did.
It does, and beautifully so, and really powerful. I love your focus there on the power of reshaping historical trauma, even the fact that the voices of your ancestors and so many ancestors and relatives from both of those lines were silenced, recognizing that in the power to now be amplifying the voices of others. I think that's such a powerful statement. So thank you for sharing all of that. One other thing that I just find so fascinating with what you shared was that idea of the othering of one's own bloodline because of the threat of losing land for mixing, for choosing to have family with those of African ancestry as an indigenous person. And part of what I find so interesting in that is just having, I was just recently reading another text that was talking about areas where white settlers were able to claim land by marrying indigenous peoples. And so just the contrast of what's happening there is so fascinating to me. Dr. Allen, as we were starting into this segment of our behind the scenes conversation, you shared a lot of really powerful stuff about the intrinsic connectivity and the history of this region, and the need and desire to recognize interconnectedness. Can you just share with our audience a little bit more about that and just your thoughts about that, your thoughts about what Ms. Kiara shared, and all of it?
Absolutely. So one of the socio-political boundaries that Kiara talked about was this idea of how blood quantum only makes her half of one thing, but the one drop rule makes her fully Black. And at the base of all of that is this idea and this notion of white supremacy, right? And so we want to be very clear about what that means. We are not talking about white people. We are talking about power structures that are purposely erected, right, for economic and capitalistic gain, right? So whether it's the grabbing of land or being able to produce cotton or other cash crops, right? She very powerfully brings this up in ways that one makes us all have to pause and consider that if we are being divided, if division is one of the key tricks and tools and strategies of white supremacy to keep us divided, and we're not talking about how on one hand, just one drop, right, makes you Black, and on the other hand, I get to, as a dominant cultural being in this country, decide how native you are, how indigenous to this land you are. It will forever keep us fighting. And if we don't understand that both are designed to keep white supremacy in play, we'll continue to fight the isms, right? So whether it is racism, sexism, genderism, this oppression Olympics, well, you may have had the Trail of Tears, but we had slavery, right? We will forever erase the beautiful history of how Native and Black communities actually work together, even in this region. When we look at the territorial statutes of this region, we know that the one thing that was named clearly was this idea of Blackness, and how Blackness, we get the Arizona Territory by, as a result of the Gadsden Purchase. It divides up from the New Mexico Territory, and we have this thing called the Arizona Territory. And what we know about the Arizona Territory is that it was hard for everybody. And it's not until you get like subpar leaders that come from the South and the North, because, believe it or not, racism is all over, not just in the South. They come here, and what really becomes evident is there are too many Mexicans and Indians right here. And if we make Arizona a state, then it really takes away our ability to reduplicate the South in Arizona. So then we have to have laws that limit things. So things like marrying out of your race, being in school while Black, right? These are on the Arizona Territory, right? So if you had a school that had Native people in it, or what we then refer to as Mexican people, and I think people also need to be really clear on, we didn't have Mexican people. We had Spaniards who went into Mesoamerica, married and had babies through, some was willful and a lot of it was forced. And then we get this race called the mestizaje, right? That then becomes Mexico. And there's still a caste system in Mexico. So even when the Pascua come up from Mexico and become the Pascua Yaqui, they're still moving away from white supremacy, right? And so then we have laws in this region that make it almost difficult to be Black as a condition of statehood, right? Because the Arizona Territory was way too liberal. And so we start creating laws that mimic Jim Crow, but then we called them Juan Crow out here, right? And so part of it was the reason why to this date that you have like things like what Dr. Skip Gates calls the the Black Nana in the closet is because we know that we actually had refuge, right, in Mexico, what is now modern day Mexico, in indigenous lands, right? And so even when we come up, the same thing happens here, even though we have the Buffalo Soldiers and kind of some misguided, again, this is the division work of white supremacy. What happens when we focus on our division and we get into racial Olympics is we forget that we were helpers one to another, that Black people actually assimilated into through marriage and through like, you know, just lineages of kind of being in Native communities. They assimilated into the culture to help survive. We were helpers one to another. And because we are now worried about, well, Black people just want to be in everything, right? We don't even get a Black studies, y'all, without the collective efforts of Native populations, of Asian American populations, you name it. We don't get these area studies that we have now without being helpers one to another. And in this region, when a lot of Black folks came up from, I believe it was New Orleans, to work in the lumber mills, it's actually Native populations who are teaching them how to survive, right, in Northern Arizona. Because we're coming from, at that point, we were coming from like Louisiana. And so if we're always focused on this divisiveness, one, we play into the tools of white supremacy, the power structure. It becomes easy for, as Kiara was saying, to other. Well, you know those Native Americans, you know those blah, 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 you know they got casinos, right? It becomes easy to fall into that without addressing the ground roots. And so if I am not very consciously aware that I am connected to Kiara and other humans across this planet, it becomes easy for me not to see you as human. And it becomes easy for me to wrap myself up in my own experience and my own history and miss the very audible connections, the very visible connections. Y'all, I live in a city called Tucson, and I believe the correct pronunciation is Chocson, which is a Native word. So all my life I have been, and not just around food and flags and ceremony, but also how we even get to sustainable practices within this climate. All of this is Native and indigenous knowledge. And you can't get that without honoring the people who have stewarded this land and continue to steward a land so that there is a University of Arizona, so that we do have watershed practices, so that we do know how to grow and cultivate crops in a very rural state, right? So we're still very much rural, but this doesn't happen without us acknowledging, one, the life-saving connections between our two populations. So I hope that answered your question. I feel like I was on a little bit of a soapbox there, but.
No, it's amazing. Part of what I find so engaging in these conversations, first of all, Dr. Allen, you always bring so much knowledge and share things that I had never heard put the way that you put them. And so I'm just so grateful for what you bring to these conversations. But one thing that really stood out to me in what you were sharing was the constant reference back to really our subject matter of acknowledgement. And there seems to be this intrinsic inability for I'll call it the white supremacist system. So not any racial identity being wholly responsible for this, but that ideology, creating the space where it is so impossible for us to simply acknowledge history and what's been done in regions like this, and how all of those things kind of travel through history to continue impacting us today when it comes to how we are able to identify or where we're not able to identify our ancestry and our lineages and the lands from which our people come. There's an interesting question that was dropped into the chat that was asking, are not those who are descendants of enslaved people indigenous to the United States, where else in the world do you find Black people like those in the US? And what I find so interesting with that question is that is a kind of a constant narrative of where Black people are indigenous to. For those born within the United States, are we indigenous to the United States? When it comes to African ancestry, there's the fact that those ancestors who were brought here were indigenous peoples of Africa who were transported. And so that idea of that form of identity is intrinsic to that narrative. And yet, because of that transportation and the human trafficking of those ancestors, we find ourselves in this place where we can't identify as indigenous to either place. We are other on these shores because we didn't come from here, but we are also other to that native land because we weren't born there either. So it's that question of, how do we develop a sense of identity, and where do we belong, and how do we move beyond that sense of not belonging, of being consistently other, to find a place in this land that we call home? I don't know if that's a question or just a tangential thought, but I'd love to hear what either of you think about that as well.
Okay, so I am of the belief, right? So once my indigenous ancestors, my indigenous African ancestors, hit what was then the British colonies, they did a lot of work to maintain African culture. But what happens when you migrate? In this case, forcible migration or kidnapping, let's call a thing. My mom from the South would say, let's call a spade, is that after a while, because we're very different from the Caribbean, I will say that. When indigenous Africans were brought to the Caribbean, because there was such a low birth rate, we constantly had to bring in more indigenous Africans, right? And in bringing in more indigenous Africans, what we know is that the culture became ingrained. So it didn't matter if you were born in Jamaica, you were still indigenous to this land in Africa, right? So if you were Angolan, you maintained a lot of that culture. That didn't necessarily happen here. In a lot of ways, as Kiara was saying, is like, because of these practices and governmental policies, there's a lot of stuff. This is what I want to say. So beautifully, Kiara tells us the lineage of her mother's people. And when it came to her telling us the lineage of her father's people, there is not enough there, and not enough ancestral understanding to go back further than, well, I think my dad's people are from, she didn't say this, but I think my dad's people are from Natchez, Mississippi, right? There's not enough there for us actually to connect our tribes, right? Because there are tribes in Africa. Yes, you can be Nigerian, but what are you, Igbo? Are you Hausa? Like there's still this indigeneity that's there. And I bring all this up to say that even when we talk about later generations of Black people who were in the United States, some of them did assimilate into Native American communities. And we know that the first Safe haven was in Florida with the Seminole Nation, right? Protecting and then being enmeshed and assimilated into that tribe as well. Now, that's not true of all nations, all Native American nations, but we do know that there was space and place there as well. So I bring this up to say this: there is an indigenous Black person who was born here, who then assimilated into the culture because of years, right, of that practice, because we're not bringing in new Africans to this space. And then what happens is a very beautiful thing is not only are we holding on to the whispers of ancestral knowledge, but then we start to create and develop, as Dr. Gates says, this underground knowledge based in orality, in this oral history, right? The griots and the storytelling that is very similar to Native communities and Native culture as well. We start passing down what little lineage that we have, right? I absolutely refuse to be othered in a country that some of my ancestors built. How? And in my very petty self, who gonna check me, right? Because at the height of enslavement, we know that just Black bodies, we're not talking about product, we're not talking about anything else, and we're not adjusting for today's monetary value. Those Black bodies were worth $4 billion. $4 billion. And not adjusted. Now adjusted, it's about $40 trillion. That's just the bodies. So I'm not going to be othered in a country that part of my ancestry built. And I kind of feel the same way about indigenous folks to this land, meaning Native American populations as well. I refuse to have them othered in a country that they have stewarded. What were we going to come to? What were these explorers, if you will, going to come to if there wasn't a land, right? What were they going to discover if there wasn't a land that was already here flowing with milk and honey? Not because they knew how to make it that way. It was already that way, right? So even when we think about the Iroquois, even when we think about the 5 nations and government systems that we copied, like some people are like, yeah, it's Egyptian, it's Greek, it's Roman. Nah, boo. This is all indigenous framework. Our government that we have right now is all indigenous. Our House of Representatives, our Congress, all of it is indigenous to this country. And we copy this from the 5 nations that were already here, right? And so, sorry, another soapbox. I just refuse to be othered in a country, even though white supremacy wants me to walk around here thinking that I don't have a stake in this country. Because if you say to my mother and her mother and her mother's mother, go back to your country, were you talking about DeKalb, Texas? Because we built that mug, right? So forgive me. This is a soapbox for me. So I just refuse to be othered, and I refuse to sit here and act as though we are here by the benevolence of European settler colonialists. We have existed since time immemorial, right? Africa and Turtle Island were popping in the 11th century before Europeans even knew what Africa was, what Turtle Island was. Absolutely not. Get out of here. I'm done, y'all.
You know, what I find so beautiful in all of that, Dr. Allen, is that you hit on the solidarity that exists in these 2 communities that have this rich history of coming together. In terms of how those of the African diaspora developed a sense of identity, it was by enfolding the culture into which they were placed and finding ways to retain what they knew, as well as enfold what they're learning into one sense of identity. And with the indigenous communities, the fact that I'm always struck by how deeply we want to lean into the false narrative of the original European explorers being welcomed with open arms and, you know, the first Thanksgiving myth and all of those sorts of things that that both deceive in the initial engagements with the indigenous peoples of this land, but also in doing that, they also overshadow the truly beautiful culture of the indigenous peoples who did provide so much of that early learning and sharing of the land and helping other groups to survive and thrive and develop their senses of identity within this place, only to be rewarded by their own erasure and destruction and annihilation. And it just strikes me that part of the conversation is that we are in this together or we're all destroyed. And that is part of this conversation for me, is recognizing that when we erase any part of that history and erase any part of those voices that are formative of a community, whether it's Flagstaff or all of Arizona or all of the United States, all that does is it continues to pit these groups against each other and tell them that they are not worthy of being part of the narrative because they don't fit into the narrative of our next subject in this conversation, which is not the elephant in the room, but the white supremacy in the room. By not fitting into that narrative, then it's not worth talking about. And if it is worth talking about, it's to ensure that they never come together in a way that enables them to see their own power and the power of being unified. So I want to talk about the white supremacy in the room. Let's move into that conversation. Kiara, you shared again earlier in the conversation that question of am I not enough of this identity or this identity to be a voice within either community? And so I'd love to hear just more of your sense of how you define your own identity, the importance of having that sense of identity and that sense of self, and the work that you do to elevate the voices of others within your community and to ensure that all of those identities are inclusive within that broader conversation. Can you share a bit more about that?
Yes, I can. I think reclaiming my Indigenous identity by learning our language, which was forcibly taken from my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather, because they were put into residential schools, which were essentially genocidal camps to remove language, culture, traditions from children, and essentially prepare them to be in military. And so no love, care, things that my family has been reclaiming, a simple act of loving and showing and sharing love through words and through actions, because that was taken away. My father's family, Dr. Allen, I know that the most that I know about his family, right, is that they came from Alexandria, Louisiana, and Prentiss, Mississippi. And so that is the furthest that I know of my family and looking into our lineage about. So I don't have that access to reclaim a language from anywhere in Africa, in any of the countries down there that I may be a descendant of. And so I think that part of being able to reclaim that I know the indigenous lineage that I have, and I know that I also came from the water of my father, and therefore that also makes me an Afro-Indigenous woman on that side, because I also have Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, but I can't define the exact tribes that my African lineage comes from. And so to let my baby know, these are the people who have sacrificed for you to be here, is part of that amplification of helping those instructors who have also been indoctrinated with the same teachings that I was indoctrinated with which taught me self-hate or self-loathing because of the way that my relatives were portrayed in the textbooks, in the teachings that happened in the classrooms, and be able to help more people to be less ignorant about the ways that we're moving through this world, and in understanding that we've all been indoctrinated. So holding that compassion and empathy for folks who have not been shared that truth. I've been asked before about why I want to teach one way. What is the point of teaching one way? And I said, well, we've already learned the one way. We are indoctrinated into the one way of the Western colonial mindset that we've been taught. And that's where that, as Dr. Allen said, you know, we received our framework for the United States from the Haudenosaunee people, the Iroquois nations, right, who are still there, who are still here. And so knowing that we received that framework, that the indigenous people saw people in stress that were going to be harmed because they could not feed themselves in this place, in this new place. And so we talk about food deserts now, but there are people who've lived in these places who've always known where the food is, who have always planted and been able to utilize the resources in that particular place to feed them and the generations that came before them. And so when they saw these people who were in distress, they are community, they're communal, they're collectivistic. So it was, we have to help them. They're in trouble, we have to help them. I don't think that they thought anything about a negative backlash that would come from that help, from that desire to help your relative, your neighbor. And so what I've always been taught is that even during the height of the civil rights movement, that the American Indian movement, AIM, and the Black Panther movement, that they came together and that they worked in solidarity with one another. And so I think that that is where those tactics of divide and conquer come from, because if everyone who loves and cares for one another is willing to stand up, whether their voice be shaking, whether they feel scared, if they're willing to stand up and speak out for their neighbors, for their brothers, for their sisters, for their mothers and their aunts and their uncles and their sons, that's where those tactics come in to stop that collectivist voice that says, this is enough. We need to do something better. We need to go in a different way. And I think that's where what I have felt is that anytime that the collective voice gets too loud, then you start to see those divisive tactics come into play. And that's why I think we're hearing now about this idea that we can't talk about critical race theory. We can't talk about the truth of the history, so we have to name it something else and put this new thing in the room that we just can't talk about. And I think that that is where we need to turn to one another and share that we all want the best for our kids. And so if we're in community, then my kids are your kids. I'm an auntie to every single student that comes in here. Depending on my relationship through them, through the Navajo people, the Diné people, through my clan as a Tutnezutni woman, that I might be their grandmother. They might be my grandmother. And so that responsibility to one another, that is what we need to get back to, is that we are all responsible for one another. And we are all responsible to help. And I think that that's the message that is coming the loudest to me from my ancestors, is that we are here to help one another. And oftentimes you're hearing now about the 7th generation, about these younger folks who are so adamant about that relationship to one another, about the land and the connection, and caring more than just today, caring more than just who is here right now. And so I think that that's where I feel the most, is that in thinking about those hesitancies or those anxieties, is that I always tell the students, like, that's not yours to keep. Imposter syndrome is not yours. Don't let other people put that. And then here I am doing the same thing, right? And so identity questions, hesitancy, those anxieties, those are not mine to hold. That wasn't ever given to me from my family, right? I've always been told who I was. And my dad always told me how to walk through this world because he knows my phenotype, right? He knew from when he named me that I was going to be seen in this world no matter what as a Black woman, and how to protect myself as a Black woman. And I have my mother who's like, and you're Indigenous, you are Tutnezutni, right? And so those people are the people that we need to tune in. And the things that you learn from people who might not like you or might be ignorant to who you are, those are the things that we don't need to keep. And I think that that's the part of learning who we are, who we come from, the frameworks, as Dr. Allen said, where did those come from? How did we get here? How did we learn to live in a desert? What knowledge do these people have that we can compensate them for properly and not just continue to take? And there's an Afro-Indigenous woman that I really look up to, Amber Stark. She goes by Melanin Muskogee. And one of her things that she always says is Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, that they go together. They're not separate. So Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty are together, and that's how we build back. We have to love one another and care enough for our community that if something happens to somebody, it's my problem too. And whoever sees that or is witness to that, it's your problem too. It's not somebody else. It's our community and our relation, and we have to get through it together. So that's just what came to me as you asked that question.
Beautiful, beautifully put. So much of this conversation is just drawing me back to, and Dr. Allen, I want to ask you to speak about some of the tactics behind what happens with some of the particularly divisive rhetoric that we can see anytime any cultural voice tries to speak up and, again, move forward in a way that brings the collective along. There always seems to be that divisive voice that comes forth to say, oh, don't trust because they're only out for themselves. And some of where we've seen that even within these dialogue series and some of the broader conversations around Flagstaff. We saw it happen with the renaming of Agassi to W.C. Riles, and the claim that that street should not be named after a Black educator. It should be named after just about anything else, a planet, a flower, all these other things, because it was seen as not being significant, and that it was just an attempt to be politically correct because it was a Black person's name. With the historic Murdoch Center, the site of the segregated school for Black youth, there's still the argument today that it is too Black as a location. And despite the multitude of voices that are represented, even within the addition of murals to the front of that building that just recently added Indigenous representation there, there were growing complaints about the murals of Black representation on one side of it, as making that a place that was only for Black people. With the Southside Community Association, we see the claim come up as we look to advance different movements or elevate other voices, that, oh, they're only interested in talking about Black things, so let's not give an inch because that's all they're interested in. And it becomes this cycle of a narrative being too Black, or too many people trying to fit into this conversation. Why should we adopt a land acknowledgement? Because that's just ignoring everybody else for the sake of just the Indigenous voice. And even with the presentation of the acknowledgement that was shared, the erasure of part of a voice that was included in that as a sign of solidarity speaks to some of those tactics, I think, as well, in terms of let's give to one what we won't give to another, and make sure they know that they are not in this together. I don't believe that was the intention, but it's what comes through in those moments. And it's that act that constantly sets up this, can I have if you have? Can I be a part of this conversation if your voice is elevated? So Dr. Allen, can you speak a little bit to where those tactics come from and maybe how we battle against that? How do we continue to fight for the solidarity that both communities that we're talking about tonight are known for, and elevate our full community when we're battling those same sorts of tactics?
First, I think we have to know, I think we have to know what's at play, right? Because this is the secret hand of socialization and white supremacy, right? And so part of that is questioning and interrogating ourselves first. Where did we learn this? Is this really my opinion? Who does this benefit? Who does this privilege? Because what we know of socialization and white supremacy is socialization is the tool that keeps white supremacy going, right? So if you've been with us before and you've seen me, I will forever preach socialization because it is so pernicious, right? It is so secretive and subtle that me saying, Kiara ain't Black, Kiara is Native. How's she gonna know about my experience, right? Well, I have to interrogate, well, where is that coming from? Why can't she be Black, right? The other thing is the naming features. When, like, even race itself is a socialization tactic, right? So we have to have some way, and you know, this is Carl von Linnaeus and his homeboy Blumenbach, who were like, clearly these people must have, some of us must be higher than the other ones, right? And even Blumenbach was into like measuring brain capacity, because they didn't fully understand how the brain worked, nor were they scientists at the time. So I think understanding how race is not an African concept and it is not an indigenous concept. When the first enslaved and free Africans came to this country, Native Americans didn't see them as Black. They saw them as humans, right? And so Native Americans were not around here talking about, well, we're about to, we are about to intentionally work towards abolition. No, when they brought these humans into their communities and into their nations, it was about nation building. It was about what is the exchange, right? And I'm not saying everything was favorable, so please don't hear that from me. But if we don't understand the naming convention, why Kiara has to be indigenous and I have to be Black, and Kiara can't be indigenous, Kiara can't be Black because she doesn't fit a certain description. These divisive tactics are put into play, and it also leads to the caste system that is very much in this country, right? So we talked about colorism last week. Well, according to that conversation, Kiara can pass. She can pass. And she has privilege, right? So we get caught up in the colorism between groups, and we don't name what it is. There is no reason that I should ever be fighting against Kiara. Kiara and I are not fighting, for those of y'all who are like, why don't you like Kiara, right? There should be no reason why something as small as color should be divisive. We should automatically be able to understand, yo, that is a divisive tactic. The whole purpose of that is to create division. When we get into things like the model minority myth, that was actually Peterson, who wrote in the Time magazine as a way to silence Black voices in the 60s, right? Late 60s. And he's like, well, look at the Chinese people. They came here and they're doing relatively well. They're a model minority, right? And so this is where we get the problematic and toxic notion of their model. If everyone would aspire to be like Asian people, right? And what it does is it erases the divisions and the different cultures within this umbrella of Asian, right? But while erasing Asian communities, we also create a division between Black and Asian communities. And so now we're fighting each other. And so then when the 1991 LA riots happened, we have two communities fighting against each other, when really what we should be focusing on is white supremacist systems, state actors, and policing, and how that happens in this country, right? And so these are just some of the tactics. When I say things like, oh, I'm Mexican, but I'm from Mexico City and I'm not indigenous. Do y'all realize it wasn't until like 2 years ago that we actually started acknowledging indigenous Black folks in Mexico as humans? And typically it was to get more funding from the IMF after natural disasters happen. We didn't acknowledge, well, not we, but the country itself did not acknowledge that at all. If we're not willing to say that there's a caste system, right? So the lighter you are, the closer your approximation to whiteness is, the more likely you are to be heard, the more likely you are to be acknowledged as an expert. The more education that you have, that kind of creates these hierarchies. I think that at the point that we start to recognize that the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know nothing at all. If not, it helps us to set up the fallacy of I'm better than you. But the biggest thing is even though race is a social construct, we have to understand that there are real consequences that happen because of that social construct in this country. Like, how dare we dirty the blood quantum by loving who you choose to love? We will financially make you pay because you decide to love who you love. We still do it today. And if we don't understand this, then when it comes time for us to stand in solidarity, whether it is because we are poisoning the water in these sovereign nations, right? And even that, let me just tell you, even that, how can we say Native communities are sovereign nations, but then we decide you don't get to decide how to govern your sovereign nation? Yes, we can come in here and take and destroy as we will, but your courts don't have the right So injustice is happening, right? The underlying treatise of that is injustice as a function of white supremacy. But if we don't understand that, if you don't understand white supremacy, the stuff that you're calling racism is systemic oppression that is mounted against each other, right? And so this is the importance of intersectionality. How do life chances change because of the social identities that I may have? What privileges or advantages do I have access to, or am I removed from? And if we don't understand that, it will be okay for us to continue to build pipes through indigenous and sovereign nations. It will be okay to continue to police Black bodies. It will be okay to continue to have markers of intelligence based on the your racial grouping in this country, a federally backed social construction in this country. And that's how white supremacy works. So this conversation is not really even about two groups being oppressed. This conversation is about how is white supremacy still driving a wedge between two communities that are intricately connected.
Beautifully put. I don't even know what else to say. I think I've said that like 15 times tonight to each of you, but the reality is you both have just spit power tonight. I mean, that's it. I want to ask if there are any other thoughts that either of you have that you want our audience to walk away with tonight. This conversation has been focused around shared recognition of the importance of a thing like a land acknowledgement and the interconnectivity of Indigenous and African diaspora connections, and the ways in which white supremacy are continuously perpetuating divisions and keeping us kind of blind to what's really happening within society in ways that keep us from unifying in the way that we could. And how we as members of the African diaspora and how members of the Indigenous communities are constantly bringing each other along. We work in solidarity, and when that happens, we are able to elevate each other and other communities along with us as part of that shared struggle towards justice, equity, and inclusion. So what should someone walk away from? If there was one thing that you could have the audience know and walk away from this conversation with, what would it be for each of you? Go ahead, Ms. Kiara.
So I would just really like to echo what Dr. Allen said, as far as when you recognize your power and privilege and access, then you utilize those socialization tools that you have and amplify other voices. And so I do recognize the privileges that I hold from being able to be lighter skinned, right? To be educated. And I do utilize that to amplify the voices of those who are not in the room, who are not invited to the conversations, and try to bring those folks in. And so I would say that is the message that I try to live, is that in amplifying those voices, that I have to recognize the privileges that I hold in order to be able to support my relatives, anybody who is my relative, by association, by me working here, by me living here, those folks who need help. And so I would say that is what I've learned, and that's the way that I've tried to acknowledge folks through the different seats that I hold of, yes, the Indigenous people, but also of the forced free enslaved labor of Black people. as well as the forced labor of so-called immigrants who are also indigenous to this land.
Dr. Allen?
Yes. So one of the things that I want everyone walking away from is this notion of we are responsible one to another, right? I can't sit in my house and say climate change doesn't affect me. It's a y'all thing. I am responsible for my imprint. Another way of saying that is I'm responsible for my impact, my intent and my impact, right? I have to own both of them. And in saying that, what I recognize is that if we are all if liberation is the main goal, y'all, we do not have time to get stuck in the doldrums of white supremacy. Because I need for us to care about the missing indigenous women that go missing every year that no one talks about, that no one can then, other than these communities. I need us to care about them like we care about our own kids. I also want us to abandon the westernized concept of family, which is my four and no more, right? And if you have internalized white supremacy, when you're like, girl, I can't be concerned but with nobody except for myself and my 3 kids, we are slowly dividing the house until it falls. And it looks like we are being responsible and stewarding our own, but we are stewards, of not just our environment, but stewards of one another. So I kind of miss the days where I was growing up and Mrs. Ramirez, who I affectionately called the neighborhood's biggest snitch, Mrs. Ramirez is probably responsible for my success as an adult, as much as my mother, who was in the house with me, right? And so I need us to understand that we are responsible for one another. So if one of us is oppressed, we are all oppressed. And there is no getting around that at all.
Thank you both. I mean, this has been an extremely powerful, engaging, insightful conversation. And I thank you for sharing your knowledge, for stepping forth and raising your voices as champions for what we're fighting for, which is all of us moving forward together. I was trying to remember one of the lyrics from Sweet Honey in the Rock. And in one of their songs, they sing, I know that I am me and you are you and we are one. And that idea that our stories are written together, and we are part of the same narrative. We are sharing our lived experiences and advancing all of us together. By telling one part of the story, it does not mean that that is the only part that we are trying to move forward. It's recognizing that these are parts of our history that we have not acknowledged. And by bringing them forward and by talking about them, we are creating avenues where everyone can move up a notch, where everyone can move forward and see themselves as part of the conversation. So thank you for engaging in this conversation. And thank you to our audience for joining us tonight. There was a beautiful conversation happening in the chat as well, with folks just sharing their thoughts and their experiences. And we are grateful for what you shared with us as well. Sorry, I'm trying to get to a page that will show me our next session, which is coming up later this week on When Cowboys Were Black, and talking about that history as well. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. I think most folks are aware of the film that was just released on Netflix, The Harder They Fall, and the focus that it puts on the narratives of of Black cowboys, and a narrative that's often ignored. So we look forward to having that conversation as well, and talking about how that shifts our perspectives of the lived experience within this nation. As always, we want to remind folks that we are moving as of January 1st, 2022. Right now, we're streaming from the Murdoch Center page, but starting in January, we'll be moving to the Live Black Experience page on Facebook. So make sure you are following both, and make sure you follow that page to ensure that you continue to be part of the conversation as we move forward. As always, we encourage you to continue engaging with these narratives and with these conversations as we seek to develop a stronger and more beautiful community through sharing our history and revealing conversations that are not often brought forward. We ask that you continue to consider making a donation to this work. And the link for doing that is in the chat for this session, as well as an opportunity to take a survey to let us know what other conversations you want to hear as part of this ongoing narrative. To close out, I just want to say again, thank you to Dr. Allen. Thank you, Ms. Khara, for joining us tonight and sharing your stories and being a voice for beautiful community. To everyone else in our audience, we encourage you to go forth, be well, and go in grace. Thank you.